Just a reminder,
by giving you a bit of background about Maytree and about this webinar. Maytree is a private charitable foundation located in Toronto. We work to combat systemic poverty and build strong civic communities in Canada. We support and operate learning and leadership opportunities that enable communities to solve their problems, and we support the development of progressive social policies. Established in 1982, the Foundation has gained international recognition for its expertise on issues related to immigration, integration, and diversity. Though, as you'll see from the work of our partners and grantees, our program and policy interests are much broader and wider. This is our 15th policy webinar. We hold them to share the ideas of our staff and partners, particularly when they publish new reports. Our hope is that by increasing the profile of their research, we stimulate debate on contemporary social justice issues. The report that is the subject of our webinar this morning is a bit different, however, because rather than being focused on a particular issue, it's a compilation of ideas on a range of issues such as income support and Social Security, democracy and participation, inclusion and protection, immigrant and refugee selection, and diversity and integration. It's a resource for those who are looking for exciting new policy ideas and often includes references for those who need more information. The publication is available on our website, and you can also access it by clicking on the download the report box at the bottom of the screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce both of our speakers. Alan is chairman of Maytree, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, and the Tamarack Institute. He's also the chairman and CEO of Havana Capital Corporation. Alan Broadbent is a businessman, a philanthropist who has played an important behind-the-scenes role over the last 15 years in generating a city's agenda in Canadian politics and public discourse. He has been a guiding influence behind initiatives such as Ideas That Matters, which gives out the James Jacobs Prize, and the Charter for Toronto IDEA. And he is also the author of the recently published book, Urban Nation: Why We Need to Give Power Back to Our Cities to Make Canada Strong. In addition, Alan is the co-chair of Happy Planet Foods, director of Sustainalytics Holding BV, a director of Invest Toronto Advisory to the Literary Review of Canada, member of the Governor's Council of the Toronto Public Library Foundation, and senior fellow of Massey College, and a member of the Order of Canada and recipient of the Queen's Jubilee Medal. And I think that he's blushing a little bit, but I felt it important to read it all to show the range of his interests and, of course, of his work. Sherri Torjman is vice president of the Caledon Institute. She has written in the areas of welfare reform, customized training, disability, income and supports, the social dimension of sustainable development, and community-based poverty reduction. Sherri was co-chair of the Technical Advisory Committee on Tax Measures for Persons with Disability that reported to the Minister of Finance and the Minister of National Revenue in December 2004. She has worked for the House of Commons Committee on the Disabled and the Handicapped, the House of Commons Special Committee on Child Care, and the Royal Commission on New Reproductive Technologies. Sherri taught a course in social policy at McGill University and is a former board member of the Ontario Trillium Foundation. In 2010, Sherri was named one of the top 25 Canadians by the Canadian Association for Retired Persons. I thank you both for participating in this webinar this morning, and over to you, Alan.
Well, thank you, Sandra, and good morning, everybody, and good morning to my colleague Sherri as well. My wife, Judy, and I started Maytree about 30 years ago with some serious ambitions, but not very much capital. And as a businessman, I figured out pretty quickly that we had better interest ourselves in leverage if we wanted to have any success achieving our ambitions. And while over the ensuing years we have managed to build our assets, we have never had enough money to solve all the social problems before us. And in fact, I would argue that even the biggest foundations in the world, if they aim their ambitions at the big issues, don't have enough money to fix things. At best, they might be able to make a big dent. So it's been our conclusion that the best way to overcome the big issues and problems is to change the way society thinks and acts. It is by tapping into the power of our collective will and attendant large public budgets that we can take the great strides forward. The greatest advances in the well-being of populations have always come from public measures. Public sanitation systems ended the plagues. Public education systems have carried nations into prosperity. Vaccination programs virtually wiped out polio and tuberculosis. Seatbelt laws have reduced road carnage, and anti-smoking ordinances have reduced lung cancers. So Maytree has focused on public policy as the biggest lever available to us in building stronger and more equitable societies. It's our view that without a public policy lens on our work, we are just engaging in a plethora of pilot projects which miss that chance to be transformative for more than a relative handful of people. And while I would never scoff at helping a handful of people, it seems more responsible to our public obligations to seek the leverage that could scale up and multiply the positive impact of our work. In our view, that comes from affecting the way we act together. We at Maytree have embraced this principle and have put a policy lens on all of our work. The publication we are releasing, Charting Prosperity, Practical Ideas for a Stronger Canada, is a view through that lens onto our work at Maytree and in various organizations we support. As you read through the document, you'll find recommendations from a broad range of our partners and associates. Our long-standing partner, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, which we co-founded with Ken Battle, continues its innovative work on income security. Caledon has been creating a new architecture for income supports for Canadians, and in Charting Prosperity, they outline critical policy recommendations for caregivers, children and their parents, disabled Canadians, working-age adults, and Aboriginals. Caledon provides a model for Canada's policy community in consistently producing policy-ready proposals, which governments can implement readily. The Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement has worked with communities across Canada on building local collaborations to deal with community issues and problems. Its principal program is Vibrant Communities, which partners with Caledon and the McConnell Foundation to create active and resilient communities with a real capacity to make change and improve conditions for people, particularly those in poverty. The Workers' Action Center focuses on issues facing contingent workers, those in precarious employment situations who are often at the mercy of unscrupulous employers who flaunt the law and cheat the workers. The Workers' Action Center works with the workers to make sure they know their rights, and it works with governments to encourage them to enforce the protections of the law that exist and implement stronger laws and regulations where necessary. We've also been working with UBC law professor Ben Perrin on issues of modern-day slavery, particularly human trafficking. Despite the outlawing of slavery in the British Empire over 200 years ago with the famous Wilberforce Amendment, and subsequent banning of slavery in other jurisdictions, human slavery is still alive in many forms and many places. It's deplorable that it is thriving in Canada and other so-called developed countries. Ben Perrin has strong recommendations to protect trafficked people and to stop the heinous international criminals, the traffickers. Maytree has been working with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association on a number of issues relating to the rights of immigrants, particularly employment restrictions placed on temporary foreign workers and the prohibition from voting in municipal, school board, and provincial elections. The CCLA is a courageous and venerable Canadian institution which continues to be at the forefront of rights issues. In related work, Maytree has supported lawyers and legal scholars Suji Chaudhry and Michael Powell at the University of Toronto Law School as they've looked at the maldistribution of votes across constituencies nationally in Canada and within each province. Rural ridings have many fewer voters than urban ones, often 50% less, which means that rural ridings have a disproportionately strong voice in our legislatures. One person, one vote is a myth in Canada. Most of the populous ridings have high immigrant and visible minority constituents, which raises a question of discrimination. This work is proceeding to see what remedies, including the possibility of a charter challenge, might be pursued. Chaudhry and Powell offer some clear recommendations in Charting Prosperity. One of the great laboratories and examples of immigrant settlement and inclusion in Canada, which is now surely recognized as a key building block of Canada, is Thorncliffe Neighbourhood in Toronto. And Maytree has been supporting the great work of Thorncliffe Neighbourhood Office, headed by the inspiring leader Jihad Alawawi. They have been advocating strongly for the extension to permanent residents of the right to vote in municipal and school board elections, on the basis that if these permanent residents are required to pay taxes to support municipal and school services, they should have a democratic right to elect the leaders. Maytree continues its work on immigration policy, and there are some very specific policy proposals related to the immigration process, and also through our support of the University of Ottawa's Refugee Forum. Charting Prosperity highlights some of Maytree's own work. The Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, or TRIAC, began as a Maytree project and has since become its own organization, which does great work in connecting skilled immigrants to the labor market. A related program is Allies, assisting local leaders with immigrant employment strategies, delivered in partnership with the McConnell Foundation to grow the TRIAC model across Canada. Maytree's Refugee Scholarship Program not only supports its scholars, but also delivers policy recommendations to improve the environment for them to succeed in Canada. And Maytree has been partnering with the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance in Diverse City, the Greater Toronto Leadership Project, which promotes instruments of diversity as a cornerstone of building inclusive communities. And Maytree's Cities of Migration program does similar work internationally by highlighting good practices and programs in cities around the world. So our support of policy work is broad and deep, and it is driven by our clear sense of what makes effective policy, which we think of as the 3 I's of effective policy: ideas, instruments, and investment. Every policy must be driven by a good idea, which holds real promise of positive change that will improve the lives of people and communities. Those good ideas must be embedded in instruments that will work, that can be implemented successfully, and that won't encounter insurmountable political barriers. The instruments must be something that governments or businesses can say yes to. And there must be investment to make it happen, either investment by governments for public policy, by business for changes to corporate employment or social engagement policy, or by institutions. Ideas, instruments, and investments must all be in place, and trying to achieve change without all 3 being present is terribly difficult. As we head into the post-federal election period, it is probably too soon to know what the government will do. But policy windows are usually unpredictable. They open and close in a way that's hard to predict, so it's better to have your policy-ready proposals ready when those windows do open, rather than scramble at the last moment. So now it is my pleasure to turn the webinar over to my Caledon colleague, Sherri Torjman. Sherri?
Hi. Thanks very much, Alan, and good morning to everybody on the line. I'd like to present a few highlights from the Policy Insights document, but before I do that, I thought it would be helpful to explain the kinds of policy recommendations that the Caledon Institute has made over the years, because effectively they fall into 3 major categories. And I thought it would be helpful to just go over these very briefly so that it's easier to understand some of the recommendations that we've made, but it may be helpful to you as well when you're thinking about your own policy work, when you're thinking about the kinds of recommendations that you would like to be able to make in your respective areas. It may be helpful to think about these various categories. So there are effectively 3 major components to our work. There are incremental reforms, there are structural reforms, and there are architectural reforms. And I'd like to just describe each of these very briefly. Incremental reforms refer to some kind of change to an existing measure. For example, it could be an increase to a benefit that's in place, let's say an income security benefit, and the increase could be in the absolute amount or the value of the benefit, and or it could be an increase to the relative amount, in other words, relative to the cost of living. So you look at the amount of the benefit and determine whether it's adequate in both absolute and relative terms. It could be an extension of benefits. For example, the duration might be increased. Or it could be expanded eligibility. And those of you who are working, for example, with families, let's say who have children with disabilities, would know that in some jurisdictions you have programs that serve children up until the age of 16. And then the adult system kicks in, and these children now move over to an entirely new system, but there's a 2-year gap. And that's especially problematic when you know that the ages of 16, 17, 18, those are difficult years under the best of circumstances. And so sometimes we recommended extending the child benefits up to the age 18, or on the other side, moving down the adult benefits to age 16 to at least address that gap. Second, there are structural reforms, and these are a bit more challenging or complex than the incremental reforms that I've described. Structural reforms involve the introduction of a new program or benefit. You're actually keeping your existing system in place. And by system, I mean a package of programs or measures that comprise a given area, like, for example, our healthcare system or our disability income system. So you're keeping that system in place, but you're looking for measures that may fill a badly needed area that is not currently being served. A significant redesign of an existing measure, and I'll give you some examples of that, or extending a current measure to a new population. So those are bigger reforms, and they would be considered structural reforms. And finally, you have architectural reforms, and that's really working at the system level. You're looking at a package of programs, and oftentimes there's an entire reconfiguration that's involved, sometimes even a shift of jurisdictions in terms of who takes responsibility for what. There's typically some new measures that are introduced, and there are associated incremental and structural reforms. And I just wanted to point out before going into the examples that these three areas are not mutually exclusive. You could work in one area on an incremental level and then move to structural reforms, move back again to incremental reforms. And in fact, some of the examples that I will give you will show that mix. So I've taken a few examples from the Policy Insights document that I thought would be of interest. In terms of incremental reform, we've recommended improvements to the working income tax benefit. Now, what's interesting is that when that benefit was introduced in the year 2007, that could be considered a structural reform. There was a piece of the income security system that really was missing. When people moved from welfare into the paid labor market, they often found that they were better off on welfare. And of course, that makes no sense. But their welfare benefits, for example, were not subject to income taxation, and they didn't have work-related costs that they incurred. So there was a piece missing. At the same time, we find that there are many people who are working full-time who are still living in poverty. And again, that's a problem related to the working poor. And so the proposal for a working income tax benefit or some kind of earnings supplementation was really intended to address those problems. Well, now that it's in place, we still have a need for incremental reform because when it was first introduced, it was really so low that it had, we considered that it likely would have very little value in terms of an incentive effect. And the design was so restricted that there were people who were earning minimum wage salaries who were not included. For example, a minimum wage worker in Ontario would not have been covered under the benefit and still is not included under the benefit because of its narrow design. So there were some changes that were introduced in 2009 following the proposals we had made, and we continue to push for incremental reforms to make this an adequate benefit. At least it's in place now as part of the architecture, but we have to work on improving that benefit, both in terms of its adequacy and with respect to its design and who it's covering. In terms of structural reform, we've made some recommendations in the Policy Insight document with respect to the tax credits pertaining to caregivers and the infirm dependent tax credit. Now, I think it's important to just explain the context for this. for many years, and I know that there are a number of you who are on the line who could speak to this issue as well. For many years, there have been organizations that have been talking about caregiver needs, and I think there's now a window of opportunity for putting forward recommendations with respect to that area. Alan was talking about windows of opportunity. You never know when those might arise, but there are a number of factors that are now making this a key public policy item on the agenda. The problem is that the way in which the benefits have been introduced really meet the needs of only a limited number of people. So there are two tax credits in place right now, the caregiver and the infirm dependent tax credits, that are designed to help offset some of the costs of caregiving. And that's a good thing. I think, the message has finally been received, has finally been heard, that caregivers do incur a wide range of additional costs in respect of their caregiving responsibilities. So there are two tax measures, as I said, that are intended to offset these costs, but there's problems in terms of their design. The first has to do with transparency. When the government introduces tax credits or puts in place these tax credits, they typically speak about them in terms of an amount. Those of you who are following the last budget, for example, had heard about the new children's arts tax credit worth $500. The problem is that the benefit is actually not worth $500. It's worth only 15% of that amount. The $500 is a base amount, and then it's multiplied times 0.15, which is actually the first marginal tax bracket. And so anytime you hear an amount, it's not actually what you get. It's less than meets the eye. But the second difficulty with the design that's not often recognized is that you don't actually get the amount, even if you're calculating the 15%, you reduce the amount of the taxes that you pay. So if you're relatively well off and you owe the government a certain amount, you can reduce your taxes by the amount of the tax credit. If you don't owe very much income tax, you can only reduce your taxes by a limited amount. And if you're too poor to pay income tax altogether, you get no benefit from those tax credits. Our concern with respect to this is the fact that all these families are actually incurring those costs, and yet it's only the higher income families that are allowed to derive a benefit in respect of those costs. And so what we've proposed is to make those tax credits refundable, which would mean that everybody would get some payment. Those who have very high income would reduce their taxes. Those with medium income would reduce their medium income and a modest amount of income tax payable would reduce their taxes and would get some back. And those who pay no tax at all actually would get an amount. So it's much more fair. Alternatively, there could be an allowance like some other countries deliver. The structural reform that we've talked about pertains to the other tax credits as well, but in this particular case, we focused only on the caregiver credits immediately because we feel that that's a very active part of the current agenda. And finally, architectural reform. And that refers to, as I mentioned, big structural reforms of systems. The example that I'll talk about today, and that's highlighted in Policy Insights, has to do with the reform of the disability income system. Now, I have to say that use of the word system to describe the disability income system is actually an undeserved compliment. It's really a patchwork of different programs that serve different populations, and you qualify on the basis of the type of disability you have, how you happen to experience a disability, whether you were born with it, whether you had an accident, whether there was a work-related accident. You have different payers who are responsible for each of those programs. So the disability income system is really a patchwork of a number of programs. But one of the problems that we feel really needs to be addressed is the fact that there's about 538,000 Canadians who currently are on some form of social assistance because they have a disability that's severe or prolonged. And that social assistance is called welfare, typically. Welfare never was designed to provide a long-term guaranteed income to any population. The purpose of welfare was to provide a last resort safety net in the event of emergency. If you happened to lose your job and you had no other form of employment or income, you had a last resort safety net, and that was a good thing. But now we're using it for more than 500,000 Canadians to provide a long-term income support. And so what we've proposed in terms of the architectural reform for this particular system is to say, let's move those people who are on some form of a social assistance onto a new federal program that would provide a basic income. Welfare right now keeps people living in poverty, even though for people with disabilities, the rates typically are higher than those provided to those considered to be unemployable. But still, they're living in poverty. They must remain in that jurisdiction. There are asset limits that restrict the kind of assets that people may have. This is under welfare, although provinces are actually becoming a little bit more liberal in that regard. There are limits in terms of any of the earnings that people may acquire through any form of employment. And so for all those reasons, we're saying, let's move those people onto a far more adequate system. If you had a new federal income program that would be designed something like the benefits that we provide for seniors, the old age security and guaranteed income supplement, you would have an income-tested program. And what that means is that the benefit would go down if you had some extra form of income, either through some other form of allowance or through some form of employment, or it would go up if you didn't have that income. And what's I think important about that is that it allows you to work if you're able to do a little bit of work to maintain your contacts, to maintain your self-esteem in some way. You can be a participating citizen. It would be a portable benefit, which means that you could live anywhere in the country and you still would have access to it. It would be adequate, and it would be indexed on a regular basis to the cost of living, just like the guaranteed income supplement currently is once every quarter. And so it would be a far more adequate and equitable benefit to deliver our income security programs in that way. Now, clearly there would be a windfall gain to the provinces because they no longer would have to pay for those people on social assistance. And so what we've been arguing is take that money under a negotiated agreement, a federal, provincial, territorial negotiated agreement. Those jurisdictions would be required to invest in a wide range of disability supports, home care, attendant care, equipment and services that people require in the home. We need to think much more intelligently and strategically about what we're doing in this domain of support and care at home and community services. We're not doing a good enough job on that front. We have to be concerned about that in terms of people with disabilities, but also the aging population. And so under this negotiated agreement, there would be a requirement to invest in those supports. And we have precedent for that in terms of the National Child Benefit, in which the federal government picked up the responsibility for a federal income payment. Provinces and territories then invested their savings in a wide range of supports and services for families, low-income families with children. Now, there's an intermediary measure that we proposed to get there, and that was to take the current disability tax credit and turn it into a refundable credit. So that would be the first step along the way toward a far more adequate income for people with disabilities. So I will wrap up at this point and turn the floor back to Sandra. But just to say one final word, and that is that architectural reform clearly is difficult and requires a lot of work, as is structural reform. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the incremental reforms are easy either. They typically have costs, they have vested interests, that hold various policies in place. And so there are challenges associated with any of these reforms. But there are very often windows of opportunity that come along, and that's when, as Alan says, we have to be ready for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherri. I've changed the screen a little bit so that everyone can submit their answers in the chat box. As soon as it's submitted, everyone will get a chance to see it, so we can start a conversation there as well if people would like to respond to the question themselves. But to begin, I'd like to pose the first question. Alan, there's a range of policies and programs that Maytree supports in a variety of different ways, and I'm just wondering, how do you choose? Because obviously the topics are so varied. What makes sort of a program sort of interesting for Maytree or sort of important to support?
I think, first of all, it has to be within Maytree's general mandate of anti-poverty work, and it has to provide some kind of innovation or high likelihood of having impact solution to a problem. I'd refer to my comments to the 3 I's. I think that it's important that the organizations or the proposals brought forward to us understand that it's important to not only have a good idea, but to be able to talk about instruments that would be effective in achieving it, but also identify what the cost would be and who would have to bear those costs. I think that's a very important thing. Another way we look at this, and it's very similar to the way we look at business investing, because we, as you know, run all of our activities out of the same office. Maytree and Havana are side by side. And we always talk about an analytical framework, which we call ideas, plan, and people. And so it's very similar to the 3 I's. The idea has to be a very good idea that has competitive advantage, that is really got a chance to be an effective solution to a set of problems. There has to be a really good and credible plan in place of how that you're going to get traction around that idea. And then we have to have faith that the people involved are the people who can actually achieve this. And so we look for all 3 of those things to be present, and that's important. The one thing that we're most interested in at Maytree is solutions. It's important to describe problems, to analyze situations and describe the problems clearly, but it's not okay to stop there, in our opinion. We have always said we don't want to be part of the culture of complaint in the country, that we want to be working on solutions, innovating, working with others to innovate solutions, and bring forward ways to solve the problems and correct the situations that need correcting.
That's great. And given this, and all of our partners, they've all each put forward a variety of ideas. If there was one, and Sherri, I will ask you the same question for Caledon, if there was one idea that you think could be implemented now and would have the most impact, which idea would that be?
Well, there are quite a few of them, but you did tell me you were going to ask me this question, so I've had to actually choose one. But the one I think is easy to do and would have a huge impact is extending the municipal vote to permanent residents and people will make an argument that it should be in all elections, but on the basic notion that you shouldn't have taxation without representation. People who are required to pay taxes in a jurisdiction should be able to cast a vote for the leaders who are going to be spending that money. And we don't think citizenship should be a necessary requirement. Perhaps a period of residency, but a fairly short period of residency. This is the idea that you need citizenship in order to vote is actually in our history a relatively new notion. And in many countries and many cities in various levels of elections, you don't need citizenship for voting. We think this would, particularly for Canada, which relies so heavily on immigrants to help build the country, we think it's an important item of inclusion, and it allows people to participate as citizens much more quickly and to, in effect, have and express a stake in the society. And I think that's an important building block for Canada.
That's interesting, Alan, because there's three places in the report where citizenship is highlighted. One is Thorncliffe Neighborhood House highlights that exact idea of extending the right to vote at the municipal level. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association also highlights it, and it comes to some extent out of our work of diversity as well. Sherri, I'd like to pose the same question to you. Of the ideas proposed by the Caledon Institute, which one do you think is sort of the most cost-effective, ready to go, would have the most impact?
Having the most impact at this time, I think likely the increases to the working income tax benefit or some modification to that benefit. I think people understand this. You know, I think that people experience the difficulties of trying to make ends meet, and they see their paychecks not increasing rapidly, but they see rapidly rising costs in terms of food and gasoline and transportation and a whole range of areas. And so there, I think, is a general sort of, I guess I would say, sympathy for moving forward on that particular policy proposal. At the same time, you have some momentum because there are provincial poverty reduction strategies, and I think that's very important when you have other jurisdictions on board, and they are looking to changes at the federal level in order to effect their own changes. So they would look very favorably upon that sort of change. And in fact, the federal government does allow provinces to vary the level of their working income tax benefits. So it's quite flexible in terms of its application. I guess the other thing that works in the favor of this benefit is that it happens to be the same, or the acronym for the benefit is the same as the Minister of Finance's riding, and he takes great delight in that. And so just on a, on a very personal note, he I think is favorable toward this particular set of proposals.
Wonderful. Sherri, there's a question from Dina. I understand from your remarks that you would rank the success for immediate changes at the federal government level to support for caregivers would be higher than better increased income support for people with disabilities. Did she understand that correctly?
It's a good question, Dina. What I was saying was that I think that caregivers' needs and the issues related to caregiving finally are on the radar screen, and it has taken many, many years, as you well know, to actually reach that point. I think there may be some openness because the way in which the benefits have actually been proposed and increased, it's not costing the federal government right now a lot of money. And so typically they will go ahead and increase those tax credits and say that they are, responding to caregiver needs. If they were to do something on the disability front, the cost would be far greater unless they simply increase the disability tax credit. So I think that it really depends on what they do, and you're likely to see them move on caregiver needs just because of the way in which the programs have been designed to date. That's one of the things that we're trying to at least discuss and consider in terms of some of the limitations and how they might move that more broadly.
Thank you, Sherri. A question about jurisdictions. Maybe you could each comment on the challenges that jurisdiction can play in Canada when one province, when one level of government says it's the other level's responsibility and vice versa. Alan?
Well, it's a huge issue in Canada, and very often, I think, if governments want to avoid doing something, that's a good stalling mechanism. But the other, I just go back to the comments I made at the end of my earlier comments about the kind of opportunistic nature of windows opening and closing on policy. It's very difficult to predict, even if you know a government has sympathy for something. So Sherri's talked about the federal government and its orientation towards disability issues, but you never know when that window will open, even when you know the sympathy is there. And this was described at something I was listening to recently as in terms of complexity, is that there's so many groups that you have to get aligned on any one issue, particularly something that is multi-jurisdictional. You can get political alignment, say, with the federal government, but you also have to get public service alignment. So the relevant public servants actually have to be on the same page to reduce the chances of conflict between the political side and the public service side. If you move to a second jurisdiction, a provincial jurisdiction, and there's some federal, say a shared federal program with it, you suddenly have four. And then if you move to something that involves municipal jurisdictions, which actually don't have any real status in Canada, but you run into yet another difficulty. And of course on the municipal side it's even more complicated because you don't have the benefit of sort of party organizations. You have city councillors in Canada typically who are unaligned and operate very much as free agents. And so the jurisdictional issue is always a complicated one. Having said that, when governments decide they want to do something, they want to do it usually fairly quickly. They get themselves aligned fairly quickly, and that's why I think it's important that to be ready with your proposal at that time.
Sherri, is there anything you wanted to add on the jurisdiction issue?
Well, you know, we see this happen so often in social policy, but in terms of the architectural reform, I think that's one of the great advantages to that kind of reform, where you're really talking about the federal and provincial territorial governments coming together around a table saying, we have a common problem. How can we sort out our jurisdictional issues? Who should do what? Who should pay for what? And, you know, to resolve that together. And we still do have federal, provincial, territorial tables around many of the main issues that we've been discussing. So if it's possible to get your concern or issue raised at one of those tables, that's actually very helpful and sort of a practical way of ensuring that the jurisdictions are working on this together rather than playing each other off and then making an excuse for why they can't do anything.
That's a great example, because when you were presenting, I was also thinking about, well, how does that architectural change happen? How do you put issues that aren't on the agenda on the agenda? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's another question here about a structural problem, this time the Canadian economy and the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. Douglas suggests that there's a need for a shift in thinking, a shift in values, the presumption that maximizing economic growth is a first principle, being, I think, the first shift that would have to happen. What would you suggest for addressing a values-based structural problem? Sherri, did you want to take that question?
Oh, sure. What an excellent question. Clearly, before you have any of these reforms, whether they're incremental, structural, or architectural, you're talking about values. And one of the things that we have tried to do is put forward a number of documents that actually speak to this issue of values. So, you know, for example, a paper that we had written called Reclaiming Our Humanity, which talked absolutely about values and how these form the foundation or the basis for a caring society. I think there are other important elements to this too. You know, some of the research that's coming out talking about social and economic well-being as being two sides of the same coin or two sides of the equation, and that they're intrinsically linked. You get even, you know, OECD literature coming out now talking about that, and I think it's important that we build on those arguments so that there are clear links being made between economic and social well-being. The other development that I think is actually quite positive and that will be helpful to us in future is to look at some of the work being done on happiness, the well-being indices and the happiness index, and talking about the fact that social well-being and people's happiness is crucial to the well-being of a nation. And this work is being done, interestingly enough, by some of the top economists in the world. That's what's so fascinating. So I think you're absolutely right. That values component is a very important piece of this work, and we have tried to put forward those arguments along with the specific policy proposals that we've made.
Thanks. Alan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it is an important question on values, and it's important for to have a narrative on values of the type of things Sherri's been talking about. And I think it's always important for groups to be very clear in a public way about what their values are and what their value base is, and to create a strong narrative, consistent, strong narrative on that. And we've been talking recently with Frank Sherri from the United States, who's an expert in communication and how advocates can be more effective in the way they communicate. He has an organization called America's Voice, and Frank talks about the importance of volume and velocity in communications that you really need. I think by volume he means both loudness and amount, and velocity, that you just you have to keep things coming at people in order to create a powerful narrative. And the danger is if you don't do that, somebody else will do it for you. So it may be a newspaper who catches you on one of your bad moments and blows it up in a way that characterizes your organization as by this one bad moment. So I think that's really important to have that. In policy terms, though, I don't think it's enough. And I think in policy terms, it's really important to put yourself in the place of the people, whether it be people in government or people in the corporate community, who you want to do something, where the change has to occur. And if you put yourself in their position, they're not really going to spend a lot of time with your value statements and your values narratives. As Jim Denning, when he was treasurer in Alberta, used to say, he wants people to bring him something he can say yes to, and not just give him a problem that he's got to figure out what the answer is to. But he always used that phrase, bring me something I can say yes to. So I think it's important that while we make the values argument, we also understand that we really have to come up with the sharp and pointed policy proposals that can be implemented and will work.
Mm-hmm. Just one more point on that, Sandra.
Sure.
Okay. Douglas, I'm sure you're familiar with the work that has come out of Wilkinson and colleagues' shop in terms of the spirit level and documenting the outcomes of growing inequality and the serious costs. And again, that's, I think, material that we can work into the values-based narrative if you actually have some empirical evidence that shows the real serious personal and societal problems associated with widening inequality. I think that helps add some power to the arguments. And then, of course, preparing the very specific policy proposals to which Alan is referring.
So we've talked it seems like we've talked a bit around the issue of the politics of this, and we had a recent federal election, and I know this is a tough question, but there's been a lot of commentary about how this the face of Parliament has changed and how that might impact Canada going forward. How do you think that this new makeup of Parliament, we have lots of new MPs, we have a majority Conservative government, how do you think this affects which policies, ideas get traction? Is this an opportunity for those of us who are interested in social policy?
Well, Sherri, of course, is in Ottawa, so she would know the answer to that. I think it's so unpredictable. I think it's so unpredictable the way governments work and what influences they have, how they choose to spend the political capital they have, what interests rise to the top of their agenda. And I think it's almost a bit of a mug's game to guess. As I said earlier, I think the best we can do with our policy work is to be ready, to be persistent, and to be making the case and be trying to get to the top of the list or up into the operational part of their list. But those windows, Sherri, you know this well. I mean, they open and close so quickly that if you're not there in an effective way, you may just miss your chance.
Absolutely. I think, though, there may be some opportunities that we can see in the current context. One of which is proposals that involve many players, like the private sector and the voluntary sector. I think that there might be some interest in that, some, social innovation and social finance-related kinds of initiatives. There's been indication in the past few speeches from the throne that they're starting to listen to that. I think it's important as well to look at governments not only in terms of the policy measures that they actually can create and put forward, but also the kinds of enabling environments that they help create for the voluntary sector and the private sector to be able to do some of this work as well. And many of you on the line will know that you face problems in terms of some of the creative work that you may have tried to do, and you run up against the provisions of the Canada Revenue Agency, and you're really hamstrung by some of the income tax provisions currently in place relating to charities. And so I think there's some important work to be done as well around helping governments understand how they can make it easier for us to do our work generally, that they can really enable some of the work that takes place. Similarly, around some community projects that they fund, oftentimes there are really serious restrictions, and you end up pencil counting, rather than really focusing your attention on the outcomes you're seeking to achieve. And in a way, having governments understand the support for communities is, it's a really important role. So there are some opportunities around that. This government was very interesting in terms of a new measure that they introduced, the Registered Disability Savings Plan. And they were excited by it, I think, because of the fact that it involved the private sector, it involved tapping into private savings. And at Caledon, we actually helped do a lot of the work, the analytic work related to the foundations of this particular proposal. So again, I think that if you're looking at some of the innovations that involve new ways of tapping into community resources or personal resources, there may be some interest in that as well. And the public policy component was actually very important in terms of allowing the claiming of the payments being made in respect of those accounts.
Thank you, Sherri. There are a number of nonprofit organizations on the line, some of whom are who work full-time in policy, some of whom are program people. And often I think there's an interest from nonprofit organizations about policy and how they can become engaged. For those organizations who may be sort of early on this road, where should they start? What should they do?
Well, I'll let Sherri answer the bulk of this, but one of the things I think is critical, and I think Caledon is probably a great example of this, is that it's really important to start with data and a strong analysis that's data-based, and not start with a bunch of opinions. And the reason for that is that when you get down to the near the end of the road of the policy process, when a government or somebody is seriously looking at implementing the policy recommendation you have, if it turns out that you were wrong about the data, or that you skated over lightly some important points, they're not only going to not implement what you want them to implement, but they're not going to listen to you anymore. And there are a number of well-known organizations in the country who start with opinions and look for data to back them up. And while they may have a fairly large public profile, their actual policy impacts over the years have been very slight. And I think, Sherri, it's fair to say that we have a discipline at Caledon, and that is starting with the data to see what the data says, and then what policy can be driven out of the data that will deal with poverty and income security issues. But the temptation is to have a point of view and look for some data to back it up. But at the end of the day, I think that's a real failing strategy.
Absolutely. And, absolutely essential to start with the data and with the evidence. I think what we try to do as well is then supplement the data with stories, with talking with people and finding out what's going on in their lives on a day-to-day basis, and trying to move those private troubles into public issues. Trying to figure out how can we assist somebody in some way through a policy measure by listening to what it is they are experiencing and then translating that into policy terms. So, for example, we were approached by the Alzheimer's Society nationally and locally to take a look at some of the problems that people were experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and we met with individuals and we met with groups. We combined it with the data and with the information that was coming out of the research to formulate some reality-based policy proposals that we knew would make a real difference in people's lives on a day-to-day basis. One of our first projects actually was for the Ontario Fair Tax Commission back in 1993, and they asked us to look at the interface between welfare and tax systems. And it was from that particular piece of work that we derived the term welfare wall. So we had reams and reams of figures and graphs coming off the computers. But at the same time, we held meetings with people. We went to visit focus groups and talk with people as we heard about many of the administrative problems that we would not have learned about had we worked only on the data. So we tried to supplement with real-life stories that then would, we could translate into policy terms. Just one final thing, and that is many of the organizations on the line I know have policy shops or teams, and they then have come together to work together, like, for example, the Canadian Caregiver Coalition, so that you have a work from the ground up, and then you try to, coalesce into a group that is now looking for evidence, for literature, and, for policy proposals based on real-life experience and data and evidence.
Thank you, Sherri. Maybe I'll just add a comment on that as well, is that I think sometimes, I think there's sort of the data that economists work with that's very, very important, but I think organizations probably have their own kinds of data that they can be sort of more strategic about collecting about their clients, about the kinds of outcomes that they see, so that, they can prove that their own measures are effective and are sort of worth scaling up. So we only have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to ask Alan and Sherri if you'd like to make some last comments.
Well, I would simply say that paying attention to policy is really paying attention to the biggest lever for change, and so getting good at it is to the benefit of your organization and to the benefit of all of us.
Sherri?
There was a question posed about some international examples, and it was around caregiving in particular, and I won't answer that now, obviously, but just to say that, there are good examples around the world, and there may be policy precedents to which we can turn elsewhere that help us make the case for some of the work that we're doing at home. So I remain optimistic that we will find some good solutions both here and elsewhere that we can work together to create a good policy framework for the issues that we're considering.
Thank you, Sherri, and thank you, Alan, for taking the time this morning to discuss your ideas with us, and thank you to all participants for your participation this morning. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, or if you've posed a question that we didn't get to, we will get back to you, or feel free to email us. Within 2 weeks, we'll be posting a copy of this webinar on our website, as well as a copy of the presentation. And our website, again, is www.maytree.com. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.